Good afternoon. Warm welcome to this webinar organized by Department of History and IQAC KE College Mangana. Respected College Principal Dr. Bridget Paul, Vice Principal Reverend Dr. Xavier C.S., IQAC Coordinator Dr. Matthew T. Telly, NAC Coordinator Dr. Sandhya C., Resource Person Dr. Malavika Binni, Convener of the webinar Professor Tindu KJ, faculty members, and dear participants. This webinar on pandemic and the past, challenges and responses will explore the many past of the phenomena referred to as epidemics and will locate epidemic into the rubric of social history. The encouragement and support rendered by Dr. Bridget Paul, College Principal, made this webinar possible. On behalf of Department of History and IQAC, I wholeheartedly welcome Dr. Bridget Paul to this webinar. Reverend Dr. Xavier C.S., College Vice Principal, is always a motivating force in all our endeavor. I take this opportunity to welcome Father to this webinar. IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Matthew T. Telly, is always supportive in all our activities. He is also a part of the organizing team. I welcome you, sir, to this webinar. I feel honored to welcome our beloved resource person, Dr. Malavika Binni, Assistant Professor, SRM University. I feel happy to inform that she is spouse of my colleague, Professor Tindu KJ. A heartfelt welcome to you, ma'am. I also welcome NAC Coordinator, Dr. Sandhya C., and convener of the webinar, Professor Tindu KJ, to this webinar. During this occasion, a heartfelt welcome all the faculty members to the webinar. Dear participants, your presence is the success of this webinar. I take this opportunity to welcome each one of you. Once again, welcome to all of you and wish you a fruitful session. Thank you. Now I invite our college principal, Dr. Bridget Paul, to inaugurate the webinar.
Respected and beloved resource person of the day, Dr. Malavika Binni, Vice Principal of our college, Reverend Dr. Xavier C.S., IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Matthew T. Telly, NAC Coordinator, Dr. Sandhya C., Head of the Department of History, Ms. Siji Mol CG, convener of this webinar, Mr. Tindu KJ, and faculty members and dear students. As we all know, COVID-19 pandemic has left no country unaffected. It is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced after Second World War. Of course, it is a health crisis, but it has affected various dimensions of our life: economic, social, psychological, and spiritual also. It has now grown to a life versus livelihood issue. All these aspects have been discussed thoroughly under different platforms in our college as well as by other institutions. Umpteen number of webinars and discussions have been held on this topic since March 2020. But today, we are going to have a very different perspective of this issue. The novelty of this national webinar lies in the fact that it analyzes the COVID-19 pandemic from a historical setting. And I'm happy that we have got a very eminent academician, Dr. Malavika Binni, as the resource person. I need not welcome her to KE family since she is already a part of it. She is the better half of dear Tindu KJ of History Department, who luckily is also the convener of this webinar. So, welcome home, dear Malavika. I also congratulate the head of the Department of History, Ms. Siji Mol CG, convener Sri Tindu, IQAC Coordinator Dr. Telly, Matthew T. Telly, for taking all the efforts to organize this webinar. And I'm sure that all participants of this webinar will be truly enlightened. With these words, I conclude and hereby declare the National Webinar on Pandemic and the Past, Challenges and Responses inaugurated. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I invite Reverend Dr. Xavier C.S. for felicitation.
Thank you, Sujit teacher. Our most dear and respected principal, Dr. Bridget Paul. Today's resource person, Dr. Malavika Binni, CG head of the Department of History. The convener of this webinar, Mr. Tintu KJ, and all the faculties and students, those who are participating in this webinar. I wish you a warm good afternoon. Today I'm very happy to know that the Department K College Mandanam is organizing a webinar on the pandemics, the past, its challenges and its responses. I'm so happy. Dr. CG teacher and Tintu sir also need to be appreciated. The pain that took to organize this webinar is very much. With a warm heart, I really appreciate and I really congratulate both of them. As we all know, throughout the course of history, diseases outbreaks have ravaged humanity, and sometimes it's changing the course of history and at times signaling the end of the entire civilizations. And in the realm of infectious diseases, a pandemic is the worst case scenario. When an epidemic spreads beyond a country's borders, that is when the disease officially becomes a pandemic. As we all know, communicable diseases existed during mankind's hunter-gatherer days, and definitely till the date. The shift to agrarian life around 10,000 years back created communities that made epidemics more possible. And even malaria, tuberculosis, leprosy, influenza, smallpox, and others first appeared during this period. And even in 20th and 21st century, many pandemics were hated us. I think in 1918, Spanish flu, in 1957, Asian flu, and in 1981, HIV/AIDS. In 2003, SARS is there, and in 2019, COVID-19 also. So we are facing a much affected pandemic situation. And in this scenario, the history department is trying to analyze its challenge, its responses. I think this webinar will be definitely a much resourceful one. And I very personally congratulate the history department once again. And as our principal mentioned, I also invite Ms. Malavika Binni to K College Mandanam. And she is also, as our principal said, he is the better half of our Tintu KJ. So you are partially, at least partially, you belong to K College Mandanam. It's not ready to officially invite you to K College Mandanam, okay? Since you are the part of K College Mandanam. So I very cordially invite to K College community. Once again, I appreciate all the persons behind this webinar, especially the accuracy coordinator, Dr. Matti Diselli, and our NAC coordinator, Sandhya, and all the participants here in this webinar. I welcome you all, and I wish you all good luck and success. May God bless us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. Now I invite Dr. Sandhya Singh to introduce the resource person.
Good afternoon. I feel greatly privileged to introduce the resource person of the day, Dr. Malavika Binni, Assistant Professor in History, School of Liberal Arts and Basic Sciences, SRM University. She was awarded doctorate on the topic Bodies, Power and Identities in Pre-Modern Kerala and exploration of medical and ritual traditions. She was also bestowed with various awards and fellowships such as Erasmus Mundus Visiting Fellowship at Leiden University, Netherlands, the prestigious Elankulam Kunjan Pillai Young Historian Prize by Kerala History Congress 2017. She worked as research associate in a project under the University of Potential Excellence Scheme JNU. She also worked in Christ University Bangalore and Indraprastha College Delhi University. Her research interests include histories of science and medicine, gender history, and Dalit studies. She is an avid traveler and has been to 31 countries for presenting at various international conferences. Currently, she is engaged in the process of translating Unnumili Sandesham, a medieval Chembu Kavyam from Manipravalam to English, and also working on the final draft of a book on Mattancheri Palace for Kerala Bhasha Institute. Madam, we are looking forward for your presentation. Welcome you to KE College, Manan.
Good afternoon, everyone. A special thanks to Dr. Bridget Paul, Principal of KE College, and my heartfelt thanks to Ms. Jimol CG, HOD, Department of History, and Mr. Tintu KJ, convener of this particular webinar, for inviting me to KE College. And I was delighted when Dr. Bridget Paul introduced me as a member of the KE family. And it is a tag that I'd love to have. Thank you also to Father Dr. Xavier CS, Vice Principal, Dr. Matthews T. Telly, IQAC Coordinator, the IQAC cell, and all those who made this webinar possible in facilitating it and in supporting it. A special thanks also to the support staff who's helping us make this possible as well. It's indeed a pleasure to address students and fellow researchers and assistant professors on the theme of one's choice, and something that one has worked on for quite some time, particularly my PhD thesis. So years ago, when I started with the theme of the history of medicine, particularly looking at Ayurveda and the exchanges of Ayurveda with other schools of medicine, such as Western medicine, which we call as allopathy, or Buddhist medicine, or Unani and Tip medicine, I wouldn't have imagined that one fine day, that we would be actually sitting in the midst of a pandemic and using an online platform to talk about an online pandemic and look at the past through the frame of present day challenges. But this is where we are. Having said that, I'm very, very glad that I think it was Dr. Francis who mentioned that the pandemic is not a new phenomena. Because if we look at the long history of diseases that mankind has faced time and again, ever since his evolution to Neolithic formation, where he started agriculture for the first time, and when he started off with settled life for first time, so just like humans have evolved, microbes have also evolved with us. Diseases have also evolved with us. So what I'm trying to do today in this particular lecture is to look at the history of pandemics, but not with regard to a history of science, rather look at it from the perspective of social history. Look at the cultural meanings that pandemics have, or how people have engaged in creating an ontology of pandemics, because one can actually think of a disease as a being or as an entity which has a particular trajectory, which takes birth and then takes birth in the popular imagination, and as it is discovered by the scientific community, and that as that knowledge is being disseminated, you also have a particular trajectory of its being moving across time and space and locating itself against a semiotic world of symbology and meanings. Now, we'll get to that in a while. But before that, let's think of some terms that we have been using quite often or quite frequently ever since the COVID-19 or 2020 pandemic broke out. So one of the terms that keeps springing up is unprecedented. So we have dime a dozen news channels telling us that we are living in unprecedented times. Students keep sending mails to me saying that, ma'am, since we live in unprecedented times, we have to resort to this and that measure. The university or universities across the world keep sending mails to their students saying that there are contingent measures that are being implemented because we are living in unprecedented times. But is the pandemic actually unprecedented? Now, if you look at, just give me one moment to share my PPT, please. So if we look at the long history of the world, what we do see is that pandemics have a very long history. In fact, it goes all the way back to the Greek writings. When Thucydides is recording the Peloponnesian War, he talks about the spread of an epidemic which put a stop to the Second Peloponnesian War. Then we do have extensive evidence of what we refer to as the Black Death or the bubonic plague. And then again, it was the cholera outbreak of 1831 and 32, which actually was the first reported or rampantly reported pandemic in the history of the world or history of the press. So like today, we have 24/7 news channels reporting about the death count every day, about the mortality rate every day, of the transmission of the disease from country to country, about the death toll in every country every day. We have sites like Covidometer, which keep updating in real time the number of deaths which are happening all over the world. So what is happening now is not an unprecedented event in the history of time. Rather, it is an unprecedented reporting which is happening, or an unprecedented reportage which is happening, where we have microblogging sites like Twitter and WhatsApp transmitting information, where each of our phones have become receptacles of information while also transmitting our views and thoughts of about the disease. So about 100 to 200 years ago, with the emergence of what Habermas refers to as the public sphere, and as the printing press became very, very popular, and with the publication of newspapers, daily newspapers and weekly newspapers and evening news journals in and around the 1800s, which became a part of a larger public sphere in Europe. When the cholera outbreak happened in 1831-32, this came to be reported rampantly. And in fact, one can actually analogize the present pandemic to the cholera outbreak of 1831-32. So caricatures started being drawn. News reports from all across the world, from Europe to the newfound Americas to India, these came to be published in the newspaper. So you have cholera which can be referred to as the first pandemic in the world. Then you have the Russian flu, or what is referred to as the influenza epidemic of 1892, which was again an epidemic of pandemic proportions. Similarly, in 1957-58, you had what is known as the Asian flu. But much, much before that, in 1918, you had what is known as the Spanish flu. And I'm just giving you a primer of all the pandemics that the world has witnessed in the last 150 or 200 years or so, just to drive in the point or nail down the point that what we are going through right now is not a never seen before phenomena. It is not an unprecedented phenomena. In fact, it has several precedents in history, and each of these precedents have valuable lessons in store for us. in terms of governance, in terms of the ideas of discursivity, in terms of the ideas of governance, in terms of containment, in terms of certain kinds of shaping of the self and shaping of the other, which have one had what is referred to as the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, and then you had the SARS, which occurred in 2003, and then you had the swine flu in 2009, which even came to India. So this is a picture of people with masks waiting to get tested in Colaba, Mumbai. And then you had the Ebola virus outbreak in 2016. And then in the long line of, or the long genealogy of diseases, if I might borrow a term from Foucault, in the long genealogy of diseases, now we have the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, if you look at the history of pandemics, it was in 1666 that Harvey G. In what is known as Morbus Anglicus, a work on infectious diseases and on morbidity or the spread of diseases, that he uses the term pandemic for the first time. But at that point of time, Harvey G's definition of pandemic is very different from our definitions of pandemic today. So he defined the pandemic as a particular disease reigning in a country. So pandemic at that point of time meant that it was a disease which would occasionally occur in a particular region or a particular country. Today, the meaning has changed to being an epidemic which spreads across countries. So even etymologically, if you look at pandemic, it has had multiple shifts in its meaning. When the cholera outbreak happened, and this was post the Columbian Exchange, when Europeans moving across the Atlantic Ocean towards the Newfoundland, which is known as North America and Latin America and Central America now. Once they moved across to this new world, they also brought with them disease. While also bringing commodities, while bringing new ideas to the new shores, while bringing new kinds of religious ideas and political ideas, as well as commercial trading exchanges through the Columbian Exchange, what was also brought was diseases. And the aboriginal population or the native population of these lands, they not only contracted the diseases because they were hitherto unexposed to the diseases, about 90% of them perished. And in the journals of people who were crossing the sea and who were recording the spread of the diseases, there are references of the term epidemic being in use, and very rarely the term pandemic being used. But it is with the spread of cholera that for the first time that the printing press started using the word pandemic as a spread of epidemic on a global scale, or the spread of epidemic from one country to the other. So even from the medical sphere, if you're looking at medical policy making or governments across the world engaging in policy making about disease and disease control, this is a term which has been not only debated, but it has also been a very controversial term. For instance, scholars both from the side of sociology as well as community medicine, and also from the medical biological side or natural scientists have asked this question: what can be referred to as a pandemic? If any disease is spread from, let's say, one part of the world to another part of the world, can it be referred to as a pandemic, or does it require some other parameters as well? So it has been today opined, and that is also on the basis of past epidemics, particularly using reference points from the Spanish flu. It has been agreed upon that a pandemic has to have at least 4 features. One is that there should be an explosive rate of transmissibility. it should spread at a very high rate. At least 100, there should be a chance of transmission of about 100 people among 1,000. So it has a 100 to 1,000 ratio. Similarly, a pandemic also should have a certain kind of a worldwide or a global extension from one country to the other. If it is restricted to one country, then it will be referred to as an endemic. And if it moves from one country to multiple nations, that is, if it has a worldwide extension, then it can be referred to as a pandemic. Similarly, there is also an idea of people not having immunity, or the idea of pandemics being resistant to the kind of medicines which are presently available in any nation. So people not having enough immunity is one leg or one parameter of a pandemic. The fourth idea, which also goes into the constitution of a pandemic, is the idea of mortality or the severity of the disease. So it's a four-pronged table that goes together to make the idea of a pandemic, and it is agreed upon today by both historians or scholars from social science and scholars from the field of medicine, that if we can find these four features related to any disease in the world, whether it is AIDS or whether it is the COVID-19 coronavirus, then we can refer to it as a pandemic. But if we move about 70 years into the past, one can also see a lot of references to the pandemic of obesity, to the pandemic of traffic deaths, to the pandemic of drug use. And particularly in America and particularly in highly developed countries in Europe, pandemic had just become a literary expression. And this was also because post the Spanish flu and post the elimination of cholera and tuberculosis through vaccination programs in the world, there was a certain sense of complacency that pandemics or widespread epidemics in the world had become a thing of the past. So something that was life-threatening, something that was understood to be of the most grave danger, shrunk to a mere literary expression in and around the 1950s. But it was with the spread of AIDS that again the term pandemic came back into popular parlance. So even if you look at the history of the very term pandemic, it is located in a semiotic of politics. Similarly, one can also argue that there is a certain authority, or there are multiple kinds of hierarchies at work in defining something as a pandemic. For instance, one can ask whether a government can declare a pandemic, or is it only WHO which can declare an epidemic as a pandemic. For instance, when the Ebola virus started spreading, it was only when it reached USA that it started being referred to as a pandemic. Till that point of time, though it was spreading through multiple nations in Africa, it was not referred to as a pandemic in the initial stages. Similarly, if we are to follow WHO's guidelines for pandemics, there are multiple phases identified. But then again, one has to ask the question, which country do we take as the ideal sample, or which country would be taken as the gold standard for understanding the etiology and the symptomatics of a pandemic? So it's beyond the purview of the discussion to get into the politics of WHO and get into the politics of policy making over the pandemic. But why am I discussing this with you at the outset? It is to just let you know that a disease or an epidemic is never just a biological thing. It's never just something that is associated with human or public health. It has larger social as well as cultural implications, and it is very closely connected to our politics, the process of othering, and also economic distress and economic crisis. So just to very quickly move to the first argument that I am trying to make today, which is pandemic and othering, or how pandemic and othering. Here, I'd like to make make a point that there are two ways in which any pandemic in history, whether it is the coronavirus of today, or the Spanish flu of 1918, or the SARS virus outbreak of 2003, or the Ebola virus of 2016, or the bubonic plague of the 14th century. Throughout the history of pandemics, one can see that there is a tendency for certain communities to be branded as the other by using the pandemic as a cultural apparatus to do so. In this argument, I would also try to make two submissions, that the pandemic leads to the surfacing of pre-existing divides. So if there is a minority, or if there is a marginalized community in a particular country which has been branded as the other, the pandemic will lead to such a situation that there will be an exaggeration of the othering process. This might lead to them being persecuted even more. This might lead to pogroms against them. This might lead to situations where they have to be annihilated from the country, or they are annihilated from the country, or they are exiled from the country, so on and so forth. So it leads to the surfacing, or it leads to coming up to the surface, or the exaggeration of pre-existing divides. On the other hand, in the times of a pandemic, in the past or the present, you also see the creation of certain geographies of disease, or certain geographies of miasmic regions or diseased regions. So the world, or a particular region, or a particular country might now be divided in the time of a pandemic into a safe zone and a zone of contamination. A zone without disease and a zone where people have disease. Now, these are all abstractions. Do remember that even in regions which are considered to be safe, there might be cases of contagious diseases, but it will be still referred to in very abstract terms as safe zones. And there will be certain regions which would be considered as zones of transmission, or zones of contamination, or as miasmic regions which are morbid. Now, if you look at the history of pandemics, the othering of certain communities and fixing the blame for the origin or the spread of disease on marginalized communities is a phenomena as ancient as the Black Death or the bubonic plague of the mid-14th century. So if you look at the history of the bubonic plague, what you see here are images from the Wellcome Institute library. In the first image, you can see people who are deceased, who have boils on their bodies, and who are being treated by missionaries and by the clergy. And in the second image, you can see the dead being disposed, graves being dug for those who have died, and the dead being disposed. But at the same time, bubonic plague, if you look at it from the perspective of Jewish memory, would be understood not as a phase or a time when the Jews got disease-ridden, but as a time when there was a pogrom fashioned against the Jews. Because most people in Europe did not understand the biology of the disease, many people believed that the Black Death was a kind of divine punishment, a retribution for sins against God, such as greed, blasphemy, heresy, fornication, and worldliness. By this logic, the only way to overcome the plague was to win God's forgiveness. So some people believed that the way to do this was to purge their communities of heretics and other troublemakers. So for example, many thousands of Jews were massacred in 1348 and 1349. Thousands more fled to sparsely populated regions and fell prey to bandits as well as to hunger. Now, associating Jews with leprosy was something which was part of southern French culture and the culture of Aragon, and it has been recorded in the church records of 1321 that Jews are the ones who are bringing leprosy into France. So pogroms against Jews using the facade of disease was nothing new to the community. And Jews as a particular community was not only a marginalized community, but was also a hunter-targeted community if you look at the history of Europe. But during the time of the Black Death, there was unprecedented ferocity in the attacks against Jews. So it led to the eradication of about 1,000 different sects of Jews from different parts of the world. So Professor Heschel at Dartmouth College, for instance, talks of the Black Death not as a history of disease that Jews had to face, but as a history of pogroms that Jews had to face, where disease was used as a cultural apparatus, or where disease was used as a ruse to eliminate Jews from nations. So Jewish memory of the Black Death was less of death by plague than of death by pogrom. The attacks were so rampant that it remains unclear if more Jews were killed by the disease or by the marauding Christians. A medieval glossator on the Talmud states that roads out of the city were dangerous as the plague, since those who flee are susceptible to marauders and thieves. By contrast, Thomas Devaney has shown that when the Black Death hit Cyprus, Christians organized religious processions to plead for God's mercy and invited Jews to join them. So it's a mixed picture that we get. That on the one side, you have countries which led pogroms against the Jews, and you have other countries like Cyprus where Jews were accepted and welcomed. Alexandra Kaffel relates that in Cairo, Muslims included Jews and Christians in the religious processions to plead for God's mercy. So violence against Jews was episodic, not continual, and the recurrence of epidemics throughout the world over and over again was only sporadically accompanied by violence. Even when you look at the 1832 spread of cholera, one can see that the idea of othering is still at work, but it's not othering of a religious community by another community or by the political authority. If you look at archives from Canada, for instance, there was a gazette published from Canada called the Montreal Gazette. So in 1832, when the cholera epidemic spread throughout Canada, the Montreal Gazette published multiple reports, one of which was recently made public, and it was an interview with a certain Catherine Parr Trail, who herself was an immigrant on her way to a new life in the backwoods of Upper Canada. So she talks about the horror that she witnessed in Montreal. So she talks about darkened dwellings and mourning for the dead, of church bells constantly tolling to announce the deaths of infants and old people and young people alike. And she claims that everywhere there were advertisements for funerals at the cheapest rate and at the shortest notice. The Montreal Gazette also notes that sometimes victims were taken straight to the cemetery because a priest with a moment to spare to read the office of the dead could not be found. In a few appalling instances, patients were hustled to their graves, seemingly dead, but in fact still breathing, left in a coma-like state by an overdose of the opium used to treat the disease. But the tragedy did not stop here. In the aftermath of the economic depression caused by the Napoleonic Wars in England, marked by unemployment and misery back in Britain, more and more migrants started flocking to the federal dominion of Canada. This led to a restructuring of the population of Canada in favor of the English-speaking population against the French-speaking population in places like Montreal. In such a climate, perhaps it was not so great a leap for some of them to believe that cholera was also a tool being used deliberately to diminish the numbers of the French-speaking people. Soon, anti-migrant sentiments started arising among the French-speaking population, and subsequently the general public, which blamed Britain for willfully spreading the disease to Canada, started writing petitions to Britain. Now one can also ask the question, could Britain have stopped the spread of the disease? Now one can only partially answer this, and the partial answer would be yes. Since there were requests from Canada, port authorities from British ports could have actually checked the passengers for symptoms of the disease, which they did not do. So this, in fact, is argued by Canadian historians as having been the roots of the or this might have led to the sowing of the seeds of the anti-British feeling among those settled in Canada. And in a mere 5 years, the rebellion of 1837-1838 broke out in Canada, which later came to be referred to as the Indian Revolution. Sorry, referred to as the Canadian Revolution. Now, if you look at the spread of cholera in India, now cholera was so rampantly spreading in India in the years 1832 and 1833 that it started to be referred to as Indian cholera. And with the emergence of this disease as a major disease spreading almost all over North India and particularly in East India, strict measures to prevent the mixing of the English soldiers with natives were enforced. This led to measures like creation of particular cantonment areas, which we still see, as well as the allocation of alcohol from the cantonment, because it was understood that when young European soldiers came to India, they would go out and mix with the natives to have a drink with them, because alcohol was not available to them and only locally made alcohol was available to them. So in order to prevent them using locally made or locally brewed alcohol, and by extension also mixing with people, for the first time, British Empire started allocating alcohol from the cantonment, which is a practice which is still continued in the Indian Army. Similarly, the Contagious Diseases Act of 1848 was passed, which enforced regular inspection of the cantonments as well as forceful confinement of Indian sex workers, so as to prevent European men from being exposed to venereal diseases. Now, syphilis was another issue which was also rampant along with cholera and before that. Now, if you're looking into the history of syphilis and particularly the etymology of syphilis, on the one hand, if you look at native sources such as the Ayurvedic records, syphilis is referred to as the Firanga Roga, or a disease which was brought by the Firanga or the Firangi or the white man. But if you look at European records, it is referred to as a tropical disease. So you can see that there is a blame game or passing the buck happening here, where the Indian records or the native vernacular records or the Sanskritic records are referring to it as the white man's disease, whereas European records are referring to it as a tropical disease. One can also see a similar kind of shifting of the blame or passing of the buck also when we look at the long history of AIDS, where in Africa, AIDS is referred to as a white man's disease. But if you look at journals published in 1960s and 70s and 80s in the US or Europe, it is referred to as a disease which has its origins in Africa. It is also called in some journals as having its origins in some tribal routines which involved bestiality. Now, none of these claims have been proved. So one can see that when you're looking at diseases, particularly and pertinently when you're looking at the history of epidemics, there is a certain othering at work where nations and societies and communities and religious and social formation not only try to make themselves distinct from the other, while also branding and defining the zone and the terrain in which the other can function. It also leads to a certain consolidation with what is understood as the self as opposed to the other. Now, coming back to the history of cholera, the spread of cholera also led to the creation of safe or disease-free islands in India, in South Africa, and in regions where the British Empire had spread, in the midst of what was perceived to be a largely disease-ridden environment. The exclusionary tendencies of the colonial state had been noted by multiple historians of medicine across the globe, such as David Arnold, Ramasubban, and Londa Schreibinger, among many others. The spread of epidemics also gives the government a chance to collect information about its citizens. One can argue that the collection of data using census and survey is a very effective tool in governing people and providing welfare measures. But others, such as post-structuralist historians, as well as in a very recent article by Yuval Noah Harari, they have also suggested that this also leads to the emergence of an infrastructure of surveillance, which the government now is given. And to use the disease or use an epidemic as a ruse or as a reason for the collection of data makes it extremely smooth for the government to very easily procure the data, because citizens themselves or subjects themselves will willfully or very willingly give the data to the government. David Arnold argues that the spread of cholera was used by the British to upscale its collection of data using extensive surveys and census, not only for stricter regulations regarding public sanitation and hygiene, but also regarding the fertility of the soil. The apartheid laws in South Africa, to a large extent, were also justified using the ruse of contagious diseases. Foucault, in his Birth of the Clinic, An Archaeology of Medical Perception, talks about the medical gaze, or the disassociation of the disease from the person's identity, in tandem with a reordering of the medical knowledge in the 19th century. He argues that the body entered a domain of discourse and became a site of discursivity. For the first time, the disease was separated from the person who was deceased. So there is a disassociation of the disease with the identity of the person who had the disease. He argues that the 19th century was not one which witnessed the flowering of medical science as the culmination of Enlightenment rationality, but he argues that it was an epistemic rupture, one marked by what he referred to as the disembodiment of disease. Bodies, tissues, and diseases could be cut up and explored by different hands at different spaces using specific kinds of apparatus. So if one bodily humor could be assessed in one particular lab, now another bodily humor could be assessed by a doctor somewhere else. Yet another doctor could look at your X-ray and bones, while someone else in some other lab is looking at your blood. So it was easier to reduce a person to a pile of organic compounds and a set of organ systems and subsequently shrink them to a statistic. Now, quite the opposite seems to be the case with epidemic diseases, particularly epidemic diseases which have had an impact on South Asia and East Asia. The identity of the patient, or his or cultural habits, his or her geographical locale and sense of hygiene and even morality becomes significant in the discourse of epidemics. Charles Rosenberg, the renowned historian of epidemics, suggests that there was, even within the medical and policy-making community, a particularly strong belief in the connection of violation, responsibility, and susceptibility to disease. During the 19th century cholera epidemic, for example, alcoholism, gluttony, sexual promiscuity, and filthy personal habits, which were widely accepted as predispositions to diseases such as cholera and smallpox, found references rampantly not only in print culture but also in medical journals. Such behaviors were seen as increasing susceptibility to disease. Even in the case of smallpox, where contagion has been accepted for centuries, this was the case. It was hardly conceivable that such behaviors could be anything other than debilitating physically as well as morally. That somebody who had the habit of drinking whiskey might escape cholera by avoiding water could hardly have been accepted or understood, because there was a heavy moral clouding or a heavy moral couching which was given to the language of diseases. So what Rosenberg is pointing towards is that diseases, particularly epidemics, inhabit the terrain of both a clinical meaning as well as a cultural meaning. Now, if one moves on, to the history of the Spanish flu, the word itself or the term itself, that is Spanish flu, which caught the fancy of many people, particularly during the coronavirus epidemic now, was referred to by the Brazilians as the German flu, while people of Senegal, the African nation, called it the Brazilian flu. People from Poland called it as the Bolshevik disease, and the Danes called it as the disease which came from the south. One of the most fascinating aspects about the Spanish flu is that it did not originate in Spain, but the first reports of fatalities actually came from US, which witnessed about 360,000 people dying in an year. Indeed, US and Germany registered, and at this point of time, one should also remember that the First World War is happening. And on either side, on the US side and the German side as well, a very large number of deaths are occurring, with about 850,000 deaths being registered from the US side in a matter of 3 years. But both countries did not want to dampen the war morale of the people and heavily censored press reporting of the disease or the spread of the disease. In Spain, on the other hand, because Spain was a neutral country, there was no silencing of the press. And this led to widespread reporting with even major political figures falling prey to the disease. And when reports about the disease spreading in Spain reached USA and reached the rest of Europe, it was sort of felt that it was a problem which was only occurring in Spain, and hence the disease was titled as the Spanish flu. India lost about 5% of its population, with about 12 to 17 million deaths, and with some calculations referring to about 13.88 million deaths occurring just in the British presidencies during this period. Now, what I'm also suggesting here is that what one sees is that disease moves through a complex process of negotiation, not only in its naming, not only is it manifest in the etymology of the terms that are given to the pandemics or the titles that are ascribed to the pandemic, but also in terms of finding its provenance. For instance, Dalia Gahu, who is a very prominent epidemiologist from Africa, suggests that there is a common convention even today among biologists, even today among epidemiologists, that once we start tracing the provenance or tracing the origins of a disease from one country to the other, people might, it always somehow ends up somewhere in Africa. And once you trace it from some country in the West to some country in the Middle East to some country in Africa, then you stop looking. Then you don't go beyond Africa, because somewhere it is understood that it must have originated from Africa. But one also stops looking after once one traces it back to Africa. One does not probe whether it has been brought to Africa from somewhere else. This itself shows that there is a certain bias which still exists even in research, scientific research and natural sciences research, when we look at the complex politics of epidemics and pandemics in the world. Now, to move on to our next topic about the negotiation between epidemics and, sorry, 1 second. Now, to move on to our next topic, which is about the negotiation between epidemics and religion. Now, if you're looking at the history of pandemics or epidemics in India, the earliest references that we have to diseases of a pandemic nature or of an epidemic nature is found in Sushruta Samhita. And here there's a particular term used to refer to an epidemic, which is Janapada Dhwansa Roga. An epidemic which smites, or a disease which smites the Janapada. Janapada referring to a chiefdom or a small kingdom. So there's a verse in chapter 6 of the Sutrasthana of Sushruta Samhita, which says, sometimes a town or a city is depopulated by a curse or anger or sin or by negative spirits. conjured up by a spell of incantation. Sometimes the pollens of poisonous flowers or grasses wafted by the winds invade a town or a village and procure a sort of epidemic, asthma or fever, irrespective of all constitutional peculiarities or deranged bodily humors. This is a reference to the Tridosha idea which you see in Ayurveda. Entire towns and villages are known to have been depopulated through malignant astral influences or through houses, wives, beds, seats, carriages, riding animals, gems, and precious stones, assuming inauspicious features. Now, there are also references in the Susruta Samhita that epidemics are sent as a scourge on the people when the rulers of that particular kingdom turn wicked. Epidemics are also understood as cursed by certain deities' own kingdoms when there is a problem with the social order. Social order understood as a caste-based social order based on Varnashrama Dharma. So, for instance, when you're looking at the Dharma Shastra, Yajnavalkya Smriti has a verse which suggests that if a Shudra or if any of the non-Dvija castes become the ruler, then there is a great possibility that a Maraka. Now, Maraka is a reference to an epidemic disease, a dangerous epidemic disease, that a Maraka might fall on the land. Arthashastra also uses the term Maraka or the term Damara to refer to diseases. Now, in the section on taxes, there is a reference to Damara. Again, there is a reference to Damara in the section on which lands can be confiscated by the state. So, if there is someone who has fallen victim to epidemics and if he has no sons, then that particular land can be now confiscated to the state. There is also an entire section or an entire chapter in book 3, which is dedicated to calamities which can befall the entire kingdom, which includes pestilence and diseases. There are some remedial measures suggested in the Arthashastra for these diseases. Similarly, in the Susruta Samhita and also in the later Ayurvedic texts, there are references to epidemic diseases like Masurika and Lekhu Masurika, understood as smallpox and chickenpox. But in the Ayurvedic context, you don't see epidemics being deified. There are no goddesses or gods of particular diseases up until the 15th century. But the situation changes in the 16th century, and in the Bhavaprakasha Samhita of the 16th century, you see references to this particular goddess who is referred to as Shitala, and she is referred to as the goddess of smallpox, a goddess of the pox. Now, you have several verses dedicated to Shitala. For instance, in the 16th chapter of the In the 16th chapter of Bhavaprakasha, there is a verse which goes like this: I respectfully bow to goddess Sitala, who is sitting naked on a donkey to relieve the sick from the disease. A person who prays to you, O Shitala, is relieved from the burning sensation and severity of the disease. Those who worship you while standing in the river will never suffer from the disease. Only you can save a person from high fever, a gangrenous smell, and a loss of vision. But one should also remember that prayer alone was never prescribed by Ayurveda. Before the prayer to Shitala, the text mentions in great details precautionary measures that needs to be taken against the disease. The text also mentions that people need to be quarantined and the deceased person should be kept away from the home. While it acknowledges that the goddess is to be propitiated through sacrifices and repeated chanting and worship, the medical side is not neglected. 7 types of the Shitala epidemic are mentioned, and 7 kinds of specific cures are also mentioned. Now, it is beyond the purview of this particular lecture and beyond my expertise to argue whether these remedies were indeed beneficial or whether it actually worked. Now, if you look at colonial records from the period, you can see that smallpox claimed a lot of lives till vaccination programs and vaccines came to our land. Now, to slightly move away from the history of disease and their close association with religion, before moving to the next section, I would also like to argue that when you're looking at the history of diseases and their association with religion, it's a mixed bag. It's a complex negotiation between religion understanding disease as a scourge of God on the one hand, but at the same time trying vehemently to find a cure for this disease. So the relationship between religion and disease, or religion and epidemic, it's a complex one. It's not a unidimensional one where, as popularly understood, disease is always understood as a scourge of God. There are diseases which are understood as scourges of God, or curse by saints, or curse because of certain habits that particular populations indulge in. But there are also diseases which are understood as manifestations of evil, which will be cured through the intervention of particular deities. Now, if you look at the narratives which involve Shitala, Shitala is understood as a personification of the disease, and the arrival of the disease would both be celebrated at the same time, met with disappointment and disillusionment in a home. At the same time, it was to Shitala herself that one would pray so as to get a remedy to that particular disease. In the case of Shitala, as in the case of other deified diseases, particularly in South Asia, one can see that the personification of malevolent deities in the medical treatises does not refrain from also talking about epidemiology and also talking about the treatments for these kind of diseases. Now, with regard to diseases and its close connection to how people respond to diseases, there's also this very curious Jewish tradition one has, which is done by the Jews during the outbreak of any pandemic or any disease, which is referred to as the Black Wedding. And the Black Wedding is not just one event which happened during the Spanish flu. So whenever you have the outbreak of a particular kind of disease or particular kind of epidemic which does not have a remedy or which does not have a vaccine, there is a Jewish custom that two orphans who belong to the not so well off economic class from within the Jewish community will be married to each other in a graveyard, and that marriage will be done with great pomp and ceremony. So during the Spanish flu outbreak, this was done in the USA. And again, when you had the influenza virus, which spread throughout New York, you would see, you can see the reference to a Black Wedding, which had occurred in the suburbs of New York. In Ukraine and in Poland, when you had the outbreak of the swine flu, you have the Black Wedding again taking place. Now, Dr. Heschel has argued that, now if you look at the wedding, it's not something that you would associate with a pandemic situation or a situation of contagion. But she says that there is more to the wedding here, or more to the conduct of the wedding here. It's a desire for the people to set things back to order. So since disease was understood as a curse by God, because things were not in order, particularly since it was understood that according to a certain kind of religious myth making, that disease is closely connected to debauchery or closely connected to non-heteronormative kinds of sexuality. One has to have a heteronormal wedding or an extremely heteronormative wedding where two strangers who are chosen by the elders of the community are wedded to each other. to sort of show the community and to sort of show the deity that things are being put back into place. So on the one hand, when disease was while disease was understood as a curse by God, on the other hand, disease is also being understood as a disorder of the society, or disease being the result of things falling out of place. So things now have to be set back in place, and whether it is the worship of Shitala or whether it is instances such as that of the Black Wedding being organized in, during the spread of epidemics, both of these suggest that there is an overloading or there is a ascription of a cultural meaning to the spread of disease. Now, like in the case of religion giving meanings to contagious diseases or giving meanings to pandemics, you also have the government giving meanings to giving political meanings or giving certain kinds of definitions to the pandemic. So with regards to government policy, Harari suggests that in this time of crisis, that is during the COVID-19 crisis, we face two very important choices. The first is between totalitarian surveillance and citizen empowerment, and on the other hand, you have nationalist isolation and global solidarity. Entire populations would have to comply with guidelines and regulations, and in human history, for the first time, it is possible now to surveil huge populations. Yet, if we are not careful, the epidemic might nevertheless mark an important watershed in the history of surveillance. Not only because it might normalize the deployment of mass surveillance tools in countries that have so far rejected them, but even more so because it signifies a dramatic transition from over the skin to under the skin surveillance. Hitherto, when your finger touched the screen of your smartphone and clicked on a link, the government wanted to know what exactly your finger was clicking on. But with the coronavirus, the focus of this particular engagement shifts. Now the government wants to know the temperature of your finger, the blood pressure under its skin. And soon, if we have technology getting to that particular level of sophistication, the government might also be able to map your blood pressure, which is also linked to your emotions. So the government will be able to map when you cry and when you laugh and when you feel proud and when you feel not so proud, or what makes you happy and what makes you not so happy. So in a way, the government will also be able to condition whole populations now with the click of a screen. For one should also understand, according to David Arnold and the epidemiologist Ostrom, that the current pandemic has also led to new notions of privacy. And privacy is being sacrificed for health. For when people are given a choice between privacy and health, they will usually choose health. But one has to remember that this is a false choice. The government can find ways to ensure privacy without sacrificing health. A self-motivated, well-informed population is far more powerful and effective than a policed, ignorant population. Now, for instance, often when we think about surveillance, it is about the government surveilling people, the government collecting data from the people. But at the same time, Harari informs us, or Harari tells us that surveillance can be a two-way tool. If we're talking about transparency, one has to talk about government transparency as well. Just as the government can ask for data from us, just as the government can demand our health records for the sake of public health and public sanitation, similarly, the government has to furnish data to us so that we can make informed choices. The reason that we do not trust the government, and there's a huge trust deficit and a culture of trust deficit out there. Why? Because both the media as well as governments have indulged in a certain kind of politics which has brought us to what can be referred to as a post-truth era. And it is this trust deficit which constrains us from truly believing in what the government puts out as its regulations. So Harari suggests that not all surveillance should be referred to as bad, but if surveillance becomes a two-way bridge, one need not think of a situation where the pandemic will lead to the shrinking of privacy. Rather, it can lead to a situation where individual privacy can still be guarded. So one lesson that we can learn from the Spanish flu of 1980 or the cholera regulations which were put forth by the British Empire is that mandatory public health measures often tend to be counterproductive. Containment is much more effective if people choose to comply. And for people to make informed choices of if they are to comply, then information needs to be given to them. But for that to happen, they need to be properly informed about what they are about to face, and also to have trust in the authorities, and a certain trust that authorities will act in their collective interest. So to conclude, in sum, an epidemic which moves on to be a pandemic has an ontological structure. It inhabits a discursive space. It takes on the quality of a social agent, mobilizing communities to act out proprietary rituals that incorporate and reaffirm fundamental social values and modes of understanding. It is that public character and dramatic intensity, along with the unity of place and time, that makes epidemics as well suited to the concerns of both moral philosophers as to the research of scholars seeking an understanding of the relationship among ideology, social structure, and the construction of identities such as the self and the other. Epidemics constitute a transverse section through society, reflecting in that cross-sectional perspective a particular configuration of institutional forms and cultural assumptions. Just as a playwright chooses a theme, or just as a novelist chooses a theme and manages a certain kind of plot development, so a particular society constructs a particular imagination of a characteristic response to the challenge that a pandemic puts forth. Now, whether the plot should be a tragedy or the plot should lead to a happy ending, it's in the hand of the citizens together with the government. And let's hope that in the case of COVID-19, that we do have a happy ending. And let it not even be an ending, let it be a thrust towards the future. And with that, let me wind up here. Thank you. I think if we have time, maybe we can take some questions.
So you have already cited that about the Spanish flu. Is there any relation between Spanish flu and the Latin American revolutions? Already Latin America, the Argentina, the Bolivia, the Peru, Chile, all these are the Latin American, where the Spaniards and the Portuguese were the rulers. They monopolized everything. They propagated their religion, and even they also beveraged the diseases. Okay. So in that accord, any relation between that Spanish flu that happened in the 80s and Latin American?
One cannot actually make a direct connection between the Spanish flu and the revolutions that emerged much later in Latin America. But one could see that if you look at Londa Sribanga's work and the circulation of both commodities and diseases through what is referred to today as the Columbian Exchange, there was a resentment. Definitely there was a resentment, and there was also the withholding of certain kinds of knowledge to the colonial masters. For instance, about routes through the forest, about certain commodities which could have been commercialized, certain kinds of medicines. So if you're looking for, let's say, the seeds or the very early traces of resentment against colonialism, maybe yes, but I don't think one can find a straight line relationship there. Because the idea of a resistance, or the idea of a solidified resistance, just like in the case of the Indian national movement, with the dawning of the idea of nationalism, it was a very large and elaborate and layered process. Maybe one spoke of it might have been also because of the Spanish flu. And as mentioned earlier, the Spanish flu was not just limited to Spain. It was just referred to as the Spanish flu because Spain was a neutral country then, and there was free press there. In fact, USA had a much bigger death toll than Spain.
Anyway, first of all, I thank you for the outstanding presentation, especially the part on the ancient Indian sources. And I wish to, can you hear me, Malavika?
Yes, I can, sir. Listening.
And when you see, since you have implicated to this miasmatic theory of environmentalism, that is propagated by the British, I think that was very well connected to the logic of profit, because you know, up to 1930s, if my memory is correct, up to 1938 or 36, there were sanitary conferences. That is World Sanitary Conferences.
It started with Paris.
With the politics to make it a point that the British Empire do not want to, actually they were not willing to lose profit from trade. So since you connected with the tropicalization of the diseases, I think the tropicalization actually had a precedence in depicting the land in India or in ancient Africa as bad tropics, as David Arnold argues. So prefixing to what you said as this kind of tropicalization related to diseases, I think the first thing that happened was a tropicalization diseases to picturizing and depicting certain areas, lands as bad tropics in that sense. You know, that was actually a policy of the colonizer or the colonial powers all over the world.
Agreed, sir, absolutely.
And secondly, I wish to comment on Yuval Noah Harari's projected. He has, I think that projection is that a far stretched, projection of what you call very interesting. As you said, it's very interesting to see that once surveillance takes its rigorous form of taking even emotions. All, I think, citizens of the world are, simply, they can be easily captured by the people in authority. Even though that is a projected account, I think there is a chance of such a takeover of the emotions also in future. But I wish to know from you, what sort of a surveillance will be there after the pandemics? That is, now people are responding to this particular surveillance from a point of view of, all of you want to get cured, or all of you want to get free from this particular infection in that sense. So now you are subjecting your body. So once the pandemic is over, is that easy for the governments with all the modern technologies as Yuval Noah Harari projects, that they can subvert these emotions and also things, Surveillance became a different thing in the post-pandemic phase. I think in that direction. What is your comment on that? Thank you, Malavika. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for both the questions, sir. As for your first question, yes, it's an absolutely correct submission. Several scholars, including Pratik Chakrabarty and David Arnold, and very recently Professor Burton Cletus, have argued that there was a certain kind of understanding that you have particular diseases emerging in the tropics, and these and hence you have a whole school of medicine referred to as the school of tropical medicine emerging in the early 19th century, and these institutes of tropical medicine continue to exist till date. So that's one line of thinking, and the other line of thinking connects it with Scythian Orientalism, where there was a pre-existing idea of a particular image of the Orient, which was initially only shaped the thinking about the Middle East in European imagination, but one was very quickly transposed to that of South Asia as well. And along those lines, one can also see that the tropical geography was now understood as a geography of morbidity, a geography of disease. And this is very closely linked to the ideas of racial superiority and racial inferiority. For instance, if you look at ancient Greek medicine or medieval Arabic text, it's the cold which is associated with disease. It's for instance, you talk about a cold corpse, a cold dead body, cold as being opposed to the warmth of health. But when you move towards 19th century, late 16th century, 17th century, and early 18th century literature, you tend to see that the tropical climate, warm climate, now come to be referred to as miasmic climates. And the logic was that the warmth of the sun makes everything disintegrate quickly. So there is a quicker rate of decay, and because of the quicker rate of decay, things tend to decay, and your health also tends to decay. So on the one hand, it is connected with the history of commerce and the history of colonialism as a profit-making venture. On the other hand, there is also a huge line of arguments based on the social history of depicting certain geographies as geographies of disease. On your second question, I want to believe that Harari might be wrong as an optimistic person, but the way that big data is working, and if you look at data sciences algorithms being put to work today with your Google Assistant or your Alexa constantly recording everything that we say, even this online meeting that we have is being recorded. So it would be very, very easy for governments to know, because for instance, when we watch something like Netflix or Amazon Prime, our choices are being recorded. So our choices when it comes to, let's say, political ideology or what kind, from something as simple as what kind of food or what kind of cuisine we prefer, to which might be our favorite political leader, or which might be our favorite political ideology, or what might be our vision of certain things, or who might we prefer as a partner, who might we prefer, are we someone who ascribes to a heteronormative ideology or not, what kind of religion do we prefer, what kind of taste does one have, let's say, in literature. So all of this information is being recorded, and that's how big data works. And even today, even without them mapping our emotions using, let's say, using our blood pressure or bodily humors, it is still being assessed by multinational corporations as well as governments. So already our tastes and preferences, which is very connected to our emotions, is being mapped by them. So maybe in 10 years time, in 20 years time, when we have even more sophisticated technology, and today we know that when we go to a shopping mall or a hospital, they can actually take our temperature without even touching us. So tomorrow there might be a possibility where a phone, if you hold a phone against our face, that phone might be able to calculate our temperature or our blood pressure. So it's a possibility that I'm not dismissing right now. But as you suggested, I want to be more hopeful that maybe such surveillance technology won't evolve out. And if it at all evolves out, that it becomes a two-way process where we can also get information from governments and agencies rather than them just getting our information. It is clear that Foucault did not speak of real pandemics, but used infectious diseases as models of thought in order to organize forms of power according to ideal typical patterns. So what Foucault suggests is the structuring of knowledge and structuring of medical knowledge which makes accessible the human body as a statistic and a terrain for governmental intervention. So whether it is a disease which is of a very large scale, such as that of a pandemic, or just a disease which is of a very personal nature. So for instance, one can talk about leprosy, which at one point of time also had several cultural meanings associated with it. Or maybe one can talk about the influenza. So whether we're talking about the influenza epidemic or a particular disease, let's say like cancer or leprosy, Foucault's idea of an epistemic rupture from the Enlightenment sort of thinking, which emphasized a lot on rationality and empiricism, to that of the production of a new kind of knowledge, which made itself susceptible or accommodative to governmentality. That's my argument here. So it does not matter whether it is an epidemic that Foucault is talking about, or a small individualized disease, because it's the epistemic rupture that's more important for us to understand the nature of the association between governmentality and a pandemic, or governmentality and a disease. Was there any widespread pandemic in past or present which happened because of biological warfare? There was an argument that anthrax was weaponized, and you had letters being sent with the microbes of anthrax, which was posted to US. So several zoonotic diseases, for instance, in the past have been argued to be weaponized and used for biological warfare. Quite curiously, since I'm an ancient historian, there were these records, and it's more part of folklore than the actual historical records, that during the Mongol movement, or the Mongol quote-unquote invasion towards Europe, you have a timer using deceased soldiers as instruments of havoc. For instance, when a soldier contracted an infectious disease, his body would be thrown into the enemy camp, or would be left behind inside forts, ramparts, so that the people who are living inside the fort, or the village inside the fort, will contract that disease. So this idea of using disease or weaponizing diseases, that again is not something new. From the medieval time onwards, one can actually see that there were at least attempts, or at least there were certain kinds of thought that indeed disease can be weaponized. Is there another question? I think we can see post-Black Death period create new change in feudal manner. Absolutely. On this historical base, can you see any change in economy, society on post-COVID era opinion? This was asked by Moideen C. Moideen C, it's a wonderful question. In fact, that's a question that I've been asking myself, and a lot of, I think, sociologists and historians and anthropologists have been thinking about this. But very recently, Harari, as a response to Harari, Michael J. Smith has asked this question, whether we can think of a post-pandemic time at all. Because we've been extremely hopeful that soon there will be a vaccine, and soon we will move out of this very challenging time of the pandemic. And that might be very wishful thinking, because is there a post-pandemic time? For instance, what SARS and Ebola virus and the H1N1 flu has told us is that we're living through those times where the disease which we refer to as a pandemic is here to stay. But we will find methods to overcome the disease. So certain kinds of sociability and sociality, and even sartoriality, for instance, us wearing masks, us constantly being aware that when we step out, we have to wear a mask, and us washing our hands. So certain habits and certain notions, for instance, of privacy that I discussed, and of surveillance, they might be here to stay. So if you're looking at, as you mentioned, post-Black Death Europe, it led one claim that has been made by historians of science is that it also aided in the breakup of feudalism. Now, it's too soon to say whether it will lead to such revolutionary changes or paradigmatic changes, but certainly pandemic situations will bring forth to the surface certain pre-existing divides that we have in society. One such movement might have been the Black Lives Matter movement, where it was certainly felt that the historic systemic oppression that the Black community or African American community in America has been facing for centuries, that was brought to the surface. So the pandemic always does that. It brings to, or an epidemic does that. It brings to the surface, or it brings to the forefront the sharp distinction between the haves and the have-nots, or the marginalized and the privileged. So yes, we can definitely think of social changes that will indeed occur in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time. Definitely, we will see such moments, and we are indeed seeing such moments. But at the same time, whether huge economic shifts will happen, because if there are several economic models which suggest that the present COVID virus will lead to an economic depression which is similar to the 2012 mortgage crisis in the US and Europe. But there are also survival mechanisms which are already at work. So I don't think that we are headed towards an economic collapse as if now, because none of the models suggest that. Do we get or trace any evidence that common people participated or conducted any rituals or sacrifices to escape from pandemics in the past? This is a question asked by Joshi John. Yes, for instance, later on, as in the 17th and the 18th century, you see Masurika being deified, and you see deities like Mariamman becoming very popular in South India, and communities, whole villages. There are references to coastal villages conducting rituals to appease Mariamman to prevent the spread of smallpox or chickenpox. Similarly, I think there are also several reports of Latin Catholic communities, both in Latin America as well as Catholic communities in Spain, indulging in mass prayer and mass. I'm sorry, I'm not getting the term for it. Where you have these assemblies where you plead together to whichever a deity, so as to propitiate that particular deity and get a remedy for that particular disease. So we do have several instances from the early past and the not so early past. So Linda Zakaria asks, how far those rampant pandemics can be associated with acts of resilience of nature? Can this sort of issues expected in a regular intervals of generations? For a very long time, when Malthusian economics held sway, it was believed that nature revives itself. And how do nature revive itself? It is by purging off at least a section or a percent of the population. But it is understood now that epidemics do not move about in cycles. Some of them some diseases become epidemics because we do not have immunity to it, and we have not taken enough measures to contain them. For instance, when the Asian flu, or what is referred to as Asian flu, broke out in Japan, there was a scientist called Hillman, if I'm not wrong, Maurice Hillman, and this is in the early 1940s, 50s period. And during this period, when the Asian flu is breaking out in Japan, he gets information that somewhere in the world that a flu has broken out, and US has a base there. So soon that disease might make its way back into USA. And using this notion, he started researching, and he found a vaccine, and very effectively a vaccination program was planned out. And among the US soldiers as well as the US citizens, vaccinations were done. So by the time, and we're talking about an early time period, about 50 years ago, when international travel was not as frequent as we witnessed today, and tourism again was also very limited. So by the time Asian flu reached USA, the American population was already immunized to it. which is a success story in the history of pandemic. So USA could contain itself, or USA could shield itself from the pandemic. So we have several such stories where several countries, for instance, the West Nile virus, the H1N1 virus, several countries were very successful in shielding themselves from diseases. So it's a combination of how well we are prepared to face a disease and how informed the citizenry is, how scientifically literate they are. Right? So I don't think that diseases occur in cyclical ways, or that diseases occur at regular intervals. There is human agency involved. And human history has been a history where we have overcome pestilence and disease. So if we are allowing cycles to repeat, that again is a lack that we as humankind, or a flaw that we as humankind has to overcome. But even if you look at epidemiology and the view posed by epidemiologists, they've moved far away from this thinking that epidemics are a retribution or a revenge that nature has on human beings. No, it doesn't work. So that's giving too much agency to nature, though we need to protect it and conserve it for sure. But at the same time, I don't think nature is a very vengeful force. Lada Janardhanan has a question for me. I think there will be definitely a change in history. Pre-COVID and post-COVID. Sure, for sure, history has never remained static. Human history has always changed. Post the bubonic plague, post the epidemic which happened during the Peloponnesian War, post the Ebola virus. So history will keep on changing. We will have new kinds of social interactions like the one we are engaging in right now. We will have new kinds of rituals happening. For instance, the hand washing ritual that we have, which we do like every hour or every 2 hours or whenever we come back. So it will become part of our habit. Maybe several European countries now have regulations on social intimacies, particularly in public. So maybe that will because there is a habit where Europeans, when they meet each other, they hug or they kiss. So our close intimacies might be curtailed again. The conspicuous kind of consumption that we have during weddings now, that might be a positive change, that we won't have it anymore. Well, these are very superficial changes which might happen. There will also be long-term changes. For instance, there will surely be a huge shift in terms of socialities being modulated. There will be a change in how governments interact with people. There will be a change in how technology is used. There will be a change in how global markets function, with things being more digitized and people preferring those kinds of trade or other kinds of interaction. So definitely there will be huge changes, but it's still too early to say. All we can say is that yes, there will be these huge paradigmatic changes, but maybe as reports come in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, we will be able to study them and give a more informed view on what those changes are. Shivangi Sharma has ma'am, it was a very good session. I just wanted to remark that just how you mentioned about Shitala Mata, I have also read similar deities present in Chinese and Japanese culture, absolutely, that were worshipped to save oneself. If this topic has already been discussed, I'm sorry, but I wonder if what kind of deities we would have for Corona now. For instance, we already have a deferred version of Corona called Corona Devi. There are also reports that Corona literally means a crown. Right? The structure of the virus, because it has spikes, sort of looks like a crown. Maybe that's why it's called Corona. So there is this particular deity called as the Mary of Corona or Corona Mata. So there are certain reports that people have started praying to Mary of Corona, so as to get a remedy for the disease. But it's a pre-existing deity, by the way. So deification will keep on happening because unfortunately, because our support systems that are provided by our governance mechanisms now have not reached that level of sophistication where we can completely let go of religious support systems or familial support systems. And as long as there is this lacunae, we will always have deification of diseases happening, because as long as people are not made scientifically literate and people are not informed about the prognosis of the disease, about the prophylactics of the disease, then of course people always need that kind of support system. And somewhere I also believe that that's the social function of religion. One tends to dismiss religion because it's also a very soft target, isn't it? But at the same time, there's a social role to it.
Thank you, Dr. Malavika, for your nice presentation and splendid responses.
Thank you.
Now, I call upon Dr. Mathis Titelli, our IQAC coordinator, for vote of thanks.
Full rainy season to all the dignitaries. As the IQAC coordinator of the college, it is my privilege to express the vote of thanks and acknowledge the contribution of those who worked really hard to make this event a grand success. On behalf of KE College, IQAC, and the History Department, I extend a real-hearted vote of thanks to our Chief Resource Person, the Spice of Mr. Tindu KJ, Dr. Malavika Binni, who spared time to grace the occasion. Your thoughts have enlightened our minds and gave a new message. Thank you, ma'am, and a prosperous day ahead. A special mention and thanks to our respected principal, Mrs. Bridget Paul, and our vice principal, who stimulated us as a catalyst to do our best. Thank you, ma'am and father. An event like this cannot happen overnight. It requires planning and a bird's eye for details. This was done by the head of the Department of History, the strong woman of the college, Dr. Professor Sijimol CG. Congratulations, ma'am, for conducting such an event. And this is happened due to Mr. Tindu KJ, who is the convener of this program. Thank you, Tindu Miss. Tindu sir, thank you, Tindu sir, for giving such an opportunity to all of us. Our sincere thanks to the MAC coordinator, Dr. Sandhya C., my office assistant, Mr. Sribin, and all the delegates who have actively participated in this program. Once again, thank you all and have a nice evening. Thank you.